Now, let's just look just briefly at Paul's process. And we get a glimpse of this in Acts 14, for instance. And we get a summary of what Paul was doing. He and Barnabas had been going up into Galatia. And, they sort of get to the end of the road and decide, well, we better go back. And because they left quite quickly from some of the places they had been, they want to go back and make a visit and check on people and see how they're doing, and actually they want to identify leaders in those churches, and they do that on that trip. The story is, this looks like a lot of those leaders are going to be appointed as pastor of these churches in less than a year, in less than a year from them hearing the gospel for the first time. So let's look at this process. Well, the first thing you do is you go out and witness and share the gospel, and then you disciple people who are coming, and they're becoming witnesses and disciples. This is simple discipleship. It doesn't take a master's degree to disciple somebody else, because you're getting them into this pattern of obedience. They're praying to the Lord every day. They're reading their Bible every day. They're getting together with other believers. And that process continues to grow. And churches grow quite quickly when this is what the believers are doing. They, in their ministry, Paul and Barnabas, and we see it throughout Paul's ministry life, they were using existing relationships. Now, sometimes those are the existing relationship within an oikos. Here's a household, and that core family's there, but it's several generations, and then they're probably servants or neighbors, maybe business colleagues and others that would consider themselves sort of all related to the family. And so within that house, they're using natural relationships, social relationships. The other one that we see repeatedly is a synagogue. Go to a city, you don't know anybody there, go to the synagogue. And again, because of who Paul was as an Old Testament scholar, he's going to, once people realize who he is, especially in the early days of his ministry, before his name started being, spread through all the synagogues, don't ever let that guy, preach. He's going to cause a division. But they went to the synagogues, and within the Jewish community, they're sharing the gospel. So this is just a smart way to make contact with people and share the gospel. And we all have to look for those kinds of relationships. Now, what we see in Paul is sort of, he's not making a big deal about it, but it's certainly there. In 1 Corinthians 1:14-16 is a great example where Paul's talking about these divisions in the church in Corinth. And he reminds them that he didn't actually baptize hardly anybody in the city of Corinth. Oh yeah, I did baptize that first family that came to the Lord in your whole province, because there were no Christians there. And then I did baptize the head of households. And we know those households came to faith, so now it would appear that head of the household baptized the others. You see, quite often, even though we're not people who believe in sacerdotal power and authority like the Catholics do with the priest who dispenses the grace of God through the Mass, we don't believe in that. We have a tendency to be so dependent on the ordained in our established church structures that we just sort of assume that that's who should be doing baptism, for instance. Now, if in many cases the pastor is the natural person to do it, but we, in our first term, we started a church that didn't yet have a pastor, and I wanted to make sure that they weren't viewing me, the outsider, as the only one who could do it, because I wanted them to keep doing it if I wasn't there. So we would often assign one of the members of the church to disciple somebody, maybe for 6 months, to make sure they understood. They're coming out of another religion, and we're going to make sure they understand, but we're trying to do it quickly because we don't want to delay it for long. So when we did baptism, the one who discipled them and who watched them grow and knows where they are, they're involved in that baptism. So Paul seems to be doing that even more quickly, probably, in Corinth, turning over baptism to people who maybe just recently been baptized themselves. In other words, Paul's not holding on to control. He is intentionally, from the very beginning, working to empower these people so that they can begin to function as church. That's an important lesson from 1 Corinthians 1 that we really should take to heart. And you train those who do lead. And again, this is, again, we're not looking for a resume from somebody from far away that we might want to put in the position. In the churches, every case pretty much, unless we're told differently, Paul and Barnabas did go to Antioch to help get it going, but there were 3 others who were from Antioch who were now leading. And when Paul and Barnabas left after their outsider mission ministry there, those people were the leaders of that church. And that's the pattern we see. Outsiders might come in to get the process started, but the church is looking for a pastor within its own community, not from far away. And so that means that as they are leading informally, you start helping them, encouraging them, doing some training with them so that they become better at it. I think that's the easiest way to get to the leaders that we're looking for. And we see Paul repeatedly assuming that you build the church through ministry of spiritual gifts, assuming not this big division between the clergy and the laity, but assuming that every single person has been empowered by the Holy Spirit to carry out an important ministry. These ministries are not necessarily organizational. We don't necessarily have an organizational chart with all of these little squares we have to fill in. No, the ministry of the church begins with the giftings of those who are the members. That's the most natural, it's actually the most supernatural way to develop the ministry of the local church. And we recognize those who are being called into ministry. Paul states that those who are in the ministry, who are recognized as leaders, are gifts from God, doesn't he? He talks about that in several places in his letters. And again, these are people not that we're looking from far away, but we're just watching to see. A number of years ago, some pastors in America were asking me, well, how do you choose the leader of a house church? Where we are, we take resumes from people all over the state maybe, and then we look at them and then send a committee to go hear them preach or whatever. How do you do that in a house church? I said, in most house churches, you ask them who the leader is, and as they're sitting around on the floor, eventually, not usually, sometimes it's immediate, they just turn and look at, August or whoever it is, John. They just turn and look at him because that's the guy who's already showing leadership. That's the guy who may have led them to Christ. It's the guy that might be discipling a number of them. So leadership is functional before it's positional in the mission church. And that's the way it should be. That's the way it certainly was in the New Testament. And then we use these passages from Paul talking about qualifications of leaders. Now he sent those letters to Timothy and Titus, but most scholars believe that the letter was written to the whole church. The whole church heard those qualifications, and now those guys are part of the mission team. They're not the pastor. Now they're there as the mission team to help the church make this decision about who their pastor is. And they're watching it very carefully, but so much of this is about the local members' knowledge of how someone is viewed and how their family life has been transformed. Outsiders are often the very worst at trying to see all of that and how it fits into the social system in the village and the neighborhood and those kinds of things. So teaching them how to choose these leaders is a critical action in this church planning process. You don't want them to just choose the wealthy patron who's there. He may be the worst spiritual leader. You don't want them to choose the tribal chief unless that chief actually is the spiritual leader of the group. Those are the kinds of things. So that's why we have biblical qualifications, and that should be the emphasis on who gets chosen. And then with the help, I believe that the missionary role with a brand new church is to help appoint and commend those who are chosen. Now, I don't see that as an ongoing role. We don't have any evidence anywhere in the New Testament of Paul or anybody else making this decision after the church has been, functioning on its own and already had a pastor. There's no evidence whatsoever. There's no hint of this as an ongoing ministry. But in this first cycle of the church choosing its leaders, then the one who's brought in the gospel and is getting this foundation laid, and in a way I sort of view this as the last stone in the foundation of this church. This outsider is involved in that, mostly I think by guiding and praying and encouraging those that might be chosen. But then again, this is not an ongoing bishop kind of authority over these churches, because at that point, again, they are autonomous, they're self-governing, self-supporting, self-propagating, right? At least that's what we hope. And then you maintain relationships. Now, Paul was on the move a lot, right? But he's also, in multiple ways, he's going back to encourage, he's writing letters when he hears of problems, or simply to just express his joy at their transformation. So that's a relationship. He's sending members of the team back to check on them. He's receiving messages and envoys from that church and sending back to the church news and encouragement. So there's this ongoing relationship, I think, that's important. And in today's world, it's maybe easier than it's been in the past. But it's not like, okay, we got the pastor installed, I'm walking away, and I'm never going to think about them, pray for them, or offer encouragement. Or in some cases, maybe offer a little correction if we see something seriously wrong. So we see this in Paul and his team. They are speaking into misaligned teaching, and that's mainly other outsiders. This is not necessarily coming from within this new group of believers. Misaligned teaching, false teaching, often comes from outside. People who are looking for a new church or a group of believers, and man, they're going to jump in and try to sway them in another direction. And then he's also speaking about misaligned behavior. We see that in the letters to Corinth, especially, where people have fallen into what we would consider gross sin. It's all gross, but these were very obviously and quite public things, like marrying your stepmom or whatever. Many things. You could be now I'm sneaking back to the temple to make sacrifices to the gods I used to serve. I mean, anything like that. If the church isn't taking care of it, if the church is not addressing it, then the missionaries are going to say something about that. They're not micromanaging. They're not second-guessing everything. Hopefully they're encouraging the leaders of that church. But when the church gets very clearly out of alignment with the gospel and out of alignment with the leadership of the Spirit, then they're going to step in and hopefully, if the church is listening, give correction. And that's essentially, from that point, then that church is established, and it's going to keep growing and developing as God gives it new gifts of leadership and pastor teachers. But the primary role of the outsider missionary coming in, I believe, sort of comes to an end at this point. And I think that's what we see in Paul's ministry.